The candle in Jaufré's hand did not tremble. He was proud of that, later. Everything else about him was frightened. His heart, his stomach, the back of his neck, where the cold air of the reliquary chapel was doing something it had no business doing in late summer, but his hand was steady, and the candle burned straight, and by its light he could see with perfect, awful clarity that the case was empty. It was a beautiful case. Cedar and iron and old dark wood, lined inside with cloth the color of a winter sky, built to hold the Oriflamme of Saint Aldric, the sacred banner of Valdorée, the most holy object in the kingdom, the thing that princes rode to war beneath and abbesses prayed over at midsummer and ordinary people walked 3 days of hard road to see, displayed once a year on the feast of the saint himself. Jaufré had seen it twice. Once as a small boy, pressed against a crowd, seeing only red silk above everyone's heads. Once up close, 2 years ago, when youths had brought him into this very chapel on an evening just like this one and shown him the reliquary as a kind of lesson. This, youths had said in his quiet and precise way, is why it matters who holds the key. The key was still in the lock. Jaufré looked at it for a long time. He was not yet 14. He had been sent ahead of the prince's procession to arrange the display at Vespers. A simple task, a runner's task. Something Raoul had given him with the calm assumption that nothing would go wrong. Tell Brother Anselm the prince wishes the banner lit by 3 candles, not 2. He always forgets. He had not forgotten about Brother Anselm until he stepped into the anteroom. The old monk was in the corner, seated against the wall as if he had simply decided to rest there, his head bowed, his lips still slightly parted in the shape of a word he had not finished. His evening prayers were on the floor beside him, the little leather-bound book open to a page Jaufré could not read from where he stood. The oil lamp on the ledge above him was still burning. It had burned down a quarter of the way, which meant Jaufré's mind did this without his permission, quietly. The way it always did, it had been burning for perhaps 2 hours since someone had trimmed it last. He had checked for breath. He had done that first, before anything. There was none. Then he had gone into the chapel and found the case. He stood now in the silence of it. The chapel was very small and very cold and smelled. Beneath the ordinary church smells of incense and tallow and stone, of something else. Something that did not belong. It was an almost familiar smell, dry and sharp and faintly sweet, like a room full of old books that had been carefully kept from damp, like wood treated against mold, like... He could not quite place it. He held the candle closer to the open case and breathed in, and the smell was stronger there, as if whatever had sat inside that lined blue cloth had carried the scent with it. Cedar, he thought, and something else, a spice. He had encountered it before. He was almost certain, but the harder he reached for the memory, the further it moved. He let it go. He looked at the key instead. It was an old key, iron, with a ring at the top worn smooth by 30 years of hands. It sat in the lock as naturally as if it had never been anywhere else. No scratches around the keyhole. No splinters on the case's edge. No sign at all that the lock had been forced. Whoever had opened it properly, with the right key, knowing exactly what they were doing. This is why it matters who holds the key. Jaufré straightened. His candle still did not tremble. He thought about what he knew, which was the habit of his mind to arrange things in order, like a clerk with a ledger. He knew an old monk was dead. He knew the most sacred object in the kingdom was gone. He knew the prince whose household he served was, at this moment, 3 miles down the river road and expecting to display that banner at Vespers in 4 hours. He knew there was an unusual smell that he could not name, and a key left in a lock that had not been forced, and a dead man whose prayers had been interrupted in the middle of a word. He knew one other thing, and this thing he pressed down before he could look at it directly, because it frightened him more than the empty case. He was the first person here. He was the only person here. And when he walked back out and told someone what he had found, everything that happened next would depend on what he said, and how he said it, and what he chose to leave out. He stood there for a very long moment, breathing cedar and cold stone and old incense, listening to the silence of the abbey outside. Then he blew out his candle and walked back into the dark. He told Raoul there had been an accident. He said it in the doorway of the guest house, quietly, with the prince's steward standing 6 feet away pretending not to listen. He said, "Brother Anselme has died. In the chapel anteroom. I believe the prince should be told before Vespers that the display may need to be." He paused here, found a word delayed. Raoul looked at him for a long time. Raoul had a face like the Mons Grisant on a cloudy day, gray and still and full of weather that had not yet decided to happen. He looked at Jaufré the way he sometimes did, as if he were checking something, as if some question in his mind had been very nearly answered by something in the boy's face. Then he nodded once and said, "Go to your room. I'll see to it." He asked nothing more. That was either because he trusted Jaufré completely, or because he already knew something was wrong and did not yet want it said aloud. Jaufré was not sure which. He was not sure of very much just then. His room in the guest house was small and smelled of river damp and the remains of someone else's candle. He lay down on the pallet with his boots still on and stared at the ceiling and listened. Prince Bertrand's voice was a low, constant sound through the stone wall, too muffled to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the voice of a man receiving news he had been expecting not to receive, and reacting to it with the very specific anger of the powerful when the world declines to cooperate. There was another voice answering, quieter, almost certainly Raoul's. The exchange went on for a long time. Jaufré counted the rhythm of it the way you count the rhythm of rain. He pressed his hand against his chest, where the folded piece of parchment sat inside his tunic. He could feel the faint crinkle of it under his palm. He did not take it out. He never took it out when there was any chance of being seen. He had not read it in so long that he barely needed to. He knew it the way you know the shape of a scar. He thought about the key in the lock. He thought about the smell he could not name. He thought about Anselme's open mouth and the half-finished word inside it, and wondered what the monk had been about to say, and who he might have been saying it to. The prince's voice rose briefly, then fell. Somewhere outside in the abbey courtyard, a night bird called once and went quiet. Jaufré lay in the dark and held his secret the way you hold a coal, carefully, and not for long, and wondered whether the wisest thing he had ever done was also, very possibly, the worst. Morning came to Notre Dame de Blancherive, the way trouble usually does, quietly at first, and then all at once. By the time the bell rang for prime, the abbey's small courtyard was full of Prince Bertrand's men-at-arms, standing in the careful positions of soldiers who have been told to look relaxed but have not quite managed it. The monks moved between them with their eyes down, going through the motions of their morning offices with the slightly stunned obedience of people who have decided that God's routine must continue regardless of what princes require. Jaufré watched from the guest house doorway. Prince Bertrand stood at the center of the courtyard in his traveling clothes, which were finer than anything the monks had ever owned. He was speaking to the sub-prior, a small, anxious man named Folke, who kept clasping and unclasping his hands, and he was smiling. It was a very good smile. It was the kind of smile that had been practiced in front of many polished surfaces and had learned, over the years, to do exactly what it was told. It did not go anywhere near his eyes. Jaufré had been watching faces since he was old enough to understand that faces and words were frequently two separate conversations happening at the same time. He watched the prince's face now and felt a quiet, familiar discomfort settle in his chest. "You look like a man studying a chessboard he didn't ask to play on." Jaufré turned. Raoul was standing 2 steps behind him, arms folded, watching the courtyard with the expression of a man who has seen this particular performance before and knows how it ends. "The prince is questioning the monks," Jaufré said. "The prince," said Raoul, "is reminding the monks that he is the prince. The questioning is incidental." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, lower, "Come with me." They walked to the far end of the cloister walk, where the sound of the courtyard faded to a murmur, and the morning air smelled of bread from the kitchen and, faintly, of the river. Raoul did not waste time. He never did. "The king is ill," he said. "Properly ill. Not court rumor ill, the kind where physicians argue about which prayers to say." He looked at Jaufré steadily. "You understand what the Oriflamme means to a coronation?" Jaufré did understand. You could not spend time in a household like Prince Bertrand's without absorbing, whether you meant to or not, the particular anxieties of men close to power. The Oriflamme de Saint Aldric was not simply a banner. It was the thing you carried when God was on your side, and more importantly, it was the thing that told everyone else that God was on your side, and in a kingdom with 2 princes and an aging king and a neighbor called Ostervane that had been watching the border roads with considerable interest. The difference between having the banner and not having it was the difference between a coronation and a catastrophe. "If it's gone," Jaufré said slowly, "and the king dies." "No legitimate crowning," Raoul said. "No crowning that both princes accept. No peace." He let that sit for a moment. Then, "In a war, Jaufré, it is not men like me who die first. We are old and tiresome, and we last forever out of pure stubbornness." The faintest shadow of something moved across his face. "It is boys like you." Jaufré said nothing. He pressed his hand briefly against his chest. An old reflex, then made himself stop. "Use your eyes," Raoul said. "Use that memory of yours. Trust no one above the rank of sub-prior. They all have too much to want." He glanced back toward the courtyard, where the prince's smile was still doing its careful work. "And do not be where that man can see you thinking." He walked away before Jaufré could answer, which was also, Jaufré had noticed, a habit of Raoul's. The old soldier delivered his pronouncements and then removed himself from the possibility of follow-up questions. It would have been maddening if the advice were not always irritatingly sound. Jaufré turned and went to look for the key he had noticed last night. He did not find the key. He found, instead, a girl sitting cross-legged on the floor outside the door to the chapter house, reading a piece of parchment with the focused intensity of someone who has been told not to read it and has decided to finish quickly before the prohibition arrives. She was perhaps a year younger than him, with ink on her left hand and the plain gray dress of a lay sister and the expression of someone who does not startle easily. She looked up when he stopped, and her eyes were very quick and very dark, and she said, without any particular greeting, "You're one of the prince's people. I live in his household." Jaufré said carefully, "That wasn't what I said." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him. "I'm looking for a key," he said. "An iron key, not large, that was hanging near the reliquary door 2 nights ago. It was gone by yesterday evening. I don't have your key." She folded the parchment she had been reading and held it in both hands, looking at him with an expression that was evaluating something he couldn't quite identify. "What do you know about Brother Anselmi?" "I know he died," Jaufré said. "And I know the banner was in the reliquary before he did and wasn't after." "That's 2 things," she said. "One of them everyone knows. The other one..." She paused. "You noticed the order? Before and after." She seemed to make a decision. "I was the last person to speak with him the night he died." Jaufré went very still, not in the way of surprise, but in the way of a mind that has just felt a piece of something slot against another piece. "I'm Guilhelmine," she said, as if this explained her entirely. "I found a letter near his body before anyone else came. I took it because I didn't know who could be trusted, and I still don't. But..." She looked at him a moment longer. "You're looking for the thing that was taken rather than looking for someone to blame for it. That's different." She held out the parchment. It was written in a careful, practiced hand, with no address and no name. The parchment itself was very fine, smoother than anything Jaufré had seen in the abbey's day-to-day work, the kind you used when something needed to last. He read it twice, slowly, feeling the faint pull he sometimes felt at the beginning of a problem, not understanding yet, but the shadow of understanding, moving at the edge of things. "What does it mean?" Guilhelmine asked. She said it without embarrassment, which he respected. She was not pretending to know things she didn't. "I don't know yet," he said, which was honest. "Where was he when you found him?" "Exactly. East end of the cloister walk. Close to the scriptorium door." They looked at each other with the mutual wariness of 2 people who have just realized they might need each other and are not entirely pleased about it. "You read quickly," Jaufré said, meaning it as an observation. "I read everything quickly," Guilhelmine said with a cheerfulness that suggested this had caused problems before. "It's a terrible habit, I've been told. I have a good memory," he said. "I've been told that too." "And is it?" He paused. "Sometimes," he said, "it's more of a problem than a gift." Something shifted in her expression, not quite sympathy, but something that recognized the shape of what he had said without needing him to explain it. She unfolded herself from the floor with the unself-conscious ease of someone not concerned with being seen at her best or worst. "Then we're equally cursed," she said. "Come on." They were passing back through the cloister when Gaucelm arrived with the second wave of the prince's party, gorgeous as a painted saint, and twice as aware of it. His lute over one shoulder, his eyes moving over the whole scene with the bright, restless attention of a man cataloging everything for later use. He spotted Jaufré and grinned in a way that managed to be both entirely genuine and entirely calculated. "My serious little friend," he said warmly. "You look like you found something interesting." "I haven't found anything yet," Jaufré said. Gaucelm's eyes moved to Guilhermine, and his expression did something pleasant and practiced. And she looked back at him with the complete lack of effect of someone who has seen pleasant and practiced and was not troubled by it. "Yet," Gaucelm repeated, as if the word tasted like something he wanted to remember. He let them go, but Jaufré felt his eyes following them all the way across the courtyard. The scriptorium was cold and dim and smelled of dust and the particular dry quiet of rooms full of old words. Guilhermine walked him straight to the east wall without hesitation, which meant she had been here before this morning, which meant she had been thinking about this since last night, which meant she was further ahead than she had let on. He filed that away without comment. She stopped and pointed at the floor. The rest of the scriptorium's stones were gray with the fine settled grit of a room swept dutifully but not obsessively, the kind of floor that accumulates a week's worth of dust and parchment shavings and tracked in earth and holds it all with the patient indifference of old stone. Here, near the east wall, the floor was clean, not swept this morning clean in the way of something scrubbed. The kind of clean that only happens when someone has something to hide. Jaufré crouched and looked at it for a long moment. He could smell it very faintly, just a trace, clinging to the cold stone. Cedar and clove oil. He had smelled that before. He could not yet remember where. The stone did not move. Jaufré had known it wouldn't. He had run his fingers along the seam anyway, feeling the new mortar, soft, still, almost yielding the way a healing scar feels different from the skin around it. Someone had done this work recently. Someone who knew the abbey well enough to find this room in the dark, and who had tools and mortar at hand, which was not the sort of thing a man carried unless he had planned to need them. "We need a chisel," Guilhermine said, "and time, and those are the two things we don't have." Gaucelm had arrived somewhere in the middle of this, materializing in the doorway of the scriptorium with the particular ease of a man who has learned to enter rooms as if he was already expected. He had looked at the clean stone, looked at Jaufré, looked at Guilhermine, and then sat down on a nearby bench and crossed his legs as if settling in for an afternoon's entertainment. "You've found something," he said. "We don't have it yet," Jaufré said. "No," Gaucelm agreed, and looked at the floor with an expression that was, for just a moment, something other than charming. Something closer to thoughtful. "But you know it's there." That's usually the harder part. He helped them cover the seam again, fitting dust back into the cracks with careful, unhurried fingers that Jaufré noted were considerably more precise than a troubadour needed them to be, and then they left the scriptorium separately, by different doors. The way people leave a place they are not supposed to have visited together. The warning came from Raoul before Vespers, delivered in the flatly tired voice of a man reporting the weather. "Hugues's men are 2 days out from Mirepoix," he said, not looking at Jaufré, watching instead the Oriflamme where it caught the last of the afternoon light below the abbey wall. "Bertrand knows. He's not happy. He will want answers before they arrive, and if he doesn't have them, he'll pull the whole household south and call it strategy, and anything still loose here will be left loose for Hugues to find first. How long do we have? Tomorrow morning, maybe, if he sleeps badly, tonight." Jaufré stood beside him at the wall and thought about a stone hatch that wouldn't open, and mortar that needed a day to dry, and he felt the familiar weight settle into his chest, that stone he always carried, pressing down. Raoul, who had been watching the river and saying nothing for the past several minutes, said, "Do you know about the first campaign?" "Under the Oriflamme." Jaufré looked at him. "Some, but the victory at Cos d'Orée, when the kingdom was young." "The victory." Raoul said it without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. "Yes, they call it that." He was quiet for a moment. The river moved. The light on it was gold and restless, the way it always was at this hour, indifferent and lovely. There was a man who counted the dead after that battle. Not a knight. A steward, a young one, just past 20, who had followed the army with the accounts. He had lists of men who had ridden under the banner, and he made himself count every name against the bodies they brought back, and the spaces where no body was brought back at all. Jaufré waited. The knights called it a great victory. They wrote songs about it. One of those songs Gosselin probably knows. I'd wager. Raoul picked up a pebble and turned it over in his fingers without throwing it. The steward counted 412 men who left home. He counted 191 names that came back with a body, and 47 that came back with a name and nothing else. The rest were numbers on a page, and holes in families that no victory could fill. He paused. He never stopped counting. Some men, once they start, cannot stop. It becomes the only honest thing left. The river kept moving. Somewhere above them, a bell was beginning its slow count toward vespers. "Who was he?" Jaufré asked. Raoul turned the pebble once more and set it down carefully on the wall's stone edge. "A young man who learned something true and couldn't unknow it," he said. "That's all." He was looking at the courtyard as he said it, at the lit window of the steward's house, where a candle was burning steadily against the early dark. Jaufré followed his eyes. And then Raoul was moving, heading back toward the great hall, unhurried, and the moment passed. And Jaufré stood alone at the wall with the feeling of having nearly understood something. The way you feel when a word sits just outside memory present, insistent, not yet named. Guilhelmine found him there a little while later. She didn't announce herself or say anything at first. She simply came and stood at the wall beside him, looking at the river, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that two people have to earn. After a while she said, Gosselm asked me what we'd found. What did you tell him? Nothing. A pause. He already knew we'd found something. He was asking to see if I'd tell him, not because he needed the information. She seemed to find this mildly interesting rather than troubling. He's very clever in a way that only works on people who aren't paying attention. He's been kind, Jaufré said, carefully. Yes, she said. Clever people usually are. It's more useful than being unkind. The air off the Oriflamme was cold, carrying the green smell of moving water and the distant gray smell of approaching autumn. And Guillemine pressed her shoulder against his very simply, without comment, the way you lean against a wall that you've decided is solid. Jaufré felt it, felt the small warmth of it, and did not move away. He looked at the river and thought about the banner under a stone floor and the mortar drying, and a man counting names against bodies in the aftermath of a famous victory, and the candle in the steward's window burning straight and steady with no draught to trouble it. He almost said something. He could feel the words forming. Something about the window, something about the smell in the scriptorium that he still could not quite place. But he had been wrong before when he was sure, and the memory of it was enough to close his mouth. So they stood there together in the cold, and the river kept moving, and neither of them said anything more, and that was, Jaufré thought, perhaps enough for now. Gosselm was drunk by the time the abbey settled into its late quiet. Not carelessly drunk, even in this he was precise, occupying just the amount of wine that loosens what a man wants loosened, and no more. He found Jaufré in the small vaulted passage between the chapter house and the dormitory, and he said, without any of his usual performance, I need to tell you something, and I need you not to use it in a way that gets me killed. Jaufré looked at him. I was asked, Gosselm said, and he was choosing his words with the careful attention of a man walking a narrow path over water, to carry certain information to the camp at Mirepoix about Bertrand's movements, his schedule here. He paused. About the Oriflamme. Who asked you? Someone in Hugues's household. Or that's what I thought. The candle in the passage wall threw his shadow long across the stone. He reached into the inner fold of his traveling cloak and withdrew a small piece of parchment, not unfolded, just held between two fingers, offered. The instruction came by letter, and the letter had a seal. Jaufré took it. He held it close to the candle. The seal was small, simple, a device he recognized, not the heraldry of any lord or prince, but the personal mark of an administrator, the kind a man uses to authenticate receipts and land records and the quiet correspondence of practical governance. He had seen it on 100 documents. He had watched the ring that made it pressed into red wax across a work table, the same table where he had first been taught to read an account book and understand what numbers meant. Cedar and clove oil. The smell in the scriptorium. The smell on the sealed stone. The candle's warmth was in Jaufré's hand. The window across the courtyard, burning steady. He understood now what Raoul had been looking at. He stood there in the passage for a long time, the parchment between his fingers and the candle guttering slightly in a draught that came from nowhere. The seal, cedar, and clove oil. The swept floor, The window burning in the scriptorium at an hour when everyone who worked in that building was supposed to be asleep. He thought about the hidden room beneath the abbey, the seam of cut stone that was too clean, the smell that had no business being there, the silence underneath the silence, like a word a man swallows before it can be heard. He had walked past that place every day for weeks and noticed all of it and understood none of it, because understanding would have required a conclusion he was not ready to reach. He was ready now. He found Guilhelmine first, because she was easier to wake and harder to startle. She slept in the lay sister's dormitory on the east side of the cloister, and she was sitting up before he had finished saying her name through the door, as though she had not quite been sleeping in the first place. "It's Eudes," Jaufré said. There was a pause. Then she came to the door in her cloak with her feet already in her shoes, which told him everything he needed to know about whether she had actually been asleep. She looked at his face. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What does he plan to do with it?" "Burn it," Jaufré said. "At dawn, on the feast day, when both princes will be here expecting to see it displayed, when there is no banner, and the ashes of a banner are found beneath the abbey, and Ostraven's duke has 3,000 soldiers 2 days' ride from this place. He thinks he's ending the war," Guilhelmine said. Her voice was very quiet. Yes. She looked past him, toward the dark cloister, toward the garth where the night sky showed cold and starless above the square of open ground. "He's going to start it," she said. That was all. She did not say it as a question. She said it the way someone says a thing they can see plainly and wish they could not. That they went for Raoul together. The old man at arms was not asleep either. He was sitting in the small room they had given him off the guest hall, a candle burning low, the tiny carved horse from his belt pouch sitting on the table before him as if he had placed it there to look at it. He looked up when they entered, and Jaufré said the name Eudes and watched what happened to Raoul's face. It went white. Not the white of shock. It was older than shock. It was the white of a man who has carried a weight for 20 years and just been told that the thing he feared would happen has now happened, and all the carrying was not enough. He said, very quietly, "The chamber beneath the scriptorium." "You knew," Jaufré said. "Not about this." Raoul picked up the carved horse and put it back in his pouch without looking at it. "About the room." "I knew about the room." He stood up. He was already wearing most of his gear because Raoul slept the way old soldiers sleep, halfway dressed, halfway listening. The Oriflamme has been kept in places men aren't supposed to find before. The last time was 20 years ago. He stopped there. Something crossed his face that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but lived between them. "We go now." They moved through the sleeping abbey in the dark. The cloister was cold, and the stones underfoot were smooth in the way old stones become smooth. Centuries of feet, centuries of weather. The slow polish of time. Their footsteps were nearly silent. Above them the sky was still fully dark, but there was something at the very edge of it, to the east, that was not quite dark anymore. The color of fire makes on clouds, when the fire is still too far away to see. Jaufré led them. He knew the way because his feet knew it, because Eudes had walked him through every part of this building in those 2 years of lessons. Here is the account room. Here is where the tithe records are kept. Here is the undercroft where the abbey stores its winter grain. He had been shown everything. It had felt, then, like generosity. It had felt like a man opening his whole world to a boy who did not have one. He stopped at the entrance to the scriptorium stairwell. Guilelmine came up beside him. She looked at his face, and she saw whatever it was in his face that was visible to her, and she did not say anything encouraging or bracing or practical. She said, instead, very quietly, "What does the floor tell you?" He looked at the floor. The floor at the base of the stairs was swept absolutely clean. In a building full of dust and winter grit, swept absolutely clean, he moved. The stone hatch was where he had known it would be, set into the south wall of the undercroft, behind the archive shelves, a seam that was too clean and too straight to be old construction. He found the catch by feel. It opened without sound, which meant it had been oiled recently, which meant someone had been using it, which meant he was right. He had been right. The stairwell beyond was narrow and cut directly from the living rock of the hill on which the abbey sat. The air that came up from it was cold and still and smelled of cedar and clove oil, so strongly now that it was almost a presence, almost a voice. Jaufré descended first, Guilelmine behind him, Raoul last, and quiet in his armored weight in a way that large men sometimes are when they have decided that what comes next is serious. The chamber at the bottom was small, perhaps 4 paces by 4 paces. The ceiling was low enough that Raoul had to angle his head. There was a single candle on a shelf cut into the wall, burning steadily in the airless space, and beside it a writing table with papers. Not many, but carefully arranged, the hand on them precise and even. And in the center of the room, on the bare stone floor, stood Eudes. He was holding the Oriflamme. It was exactly as the chronicles described it, a length of silk the deep orange gold of a flame, stitched through with threads that caught the candlelight and held it, a banner that had ridden to battle and back so many times that the fabric had a kind of weight to it that had nothing to do with silk. Eudes held it against his chest with both arms, the way a man holds something he loves and means to set down for the last time. He looked at Jaufré. He did not look surprised. "I thought you might come," Eudes said. His voice was the same voice that had read account books aloud across a work table. Careful, steady, the voice of a man who has thought about every word before he says it. "Sit down, if you like." There was nowhere to sit. No one moved. "You know why?" Eudes said. It was not a question. "Tell me anyway," Jaufré said. And Eudes did. He spoke quietly, the way he always had, and he told them about the old king riding out under this banner with 1,500 knights and coming back with 200. He told them about the boys from the river villages who had marched under it singing and had never come home to sing again. He told them that a piece of silk does not carry God's favor. It carries men's certainty, and certainty is the most dangerous thing a man can carry into a field of battle because it blinds him to the moment when he should stop. He said he had watched the banner used as a tool for 30 years, and he was not going to watch it used again. Not with Ostravenne massing on the border. Not with 2 princes who wanted a reason. He was right about so many things. Jaufré listened to all of it. He listened the way he always listened. Completely, quietly, with the kind of attention that people mistook for submission. He listened, and he understood, and he believed almost every word. And when Eudes was finished, and the chamber was still, Jaufré said, "You counted the dead. I believe you." His voice was steady. He was surprised, slightly, to find that it was steady. But you can't decide for everyone that the lie is more dangerous than the war. That's not yours to decide. That decision belongs to Valdorée, not to one man in a basement with a candle. The silence that followed was the longest silence Jaufré had ever stood inside. Eudes looked at him. The same look across the work table. The same careful attention that had once felt only like kindness. Then, slowly, he held out the Oriflamme. Jaufré took it. It was heavier than he had expected. The silk was cold from the stone room, and the threads caught even this small light and held it. Eudes sat down on the floor, his back against the wall, his hands resting open on his knees. He did not say anything more. He looked at the candle, at the top of the stairwell, pressed through the narrow shaft of the hatch above them. The darkness was no longer quite dark. It was gray, the particular gray that is not night anymore and not yet morning. The color the world goes in the last held breath before the sun decides. Jaufré stood in the low stone room with the Oriflamme in his arms, and the night was barely over, and it had not been enough. The gray at the top of the stairwell grew slowly, the way all certain things grow without hurry, without asking permission. Jaufré climbed out of the hidden room first, the Oriflamme folded across his arms like something sleeping. Guillaumin took his hand at the top and pulled, not because he needed the help, but because she was there, and her hand was warm, and the stone was cold, and some gestures do not require a reason. Raoul came last, moving carefully on his old knees, and when he straightened up in the scriptorium and saw the banner in Jaufré's arms, something shifted in his face, not quite relief, not quite grief, but the particular expression of a man watching something come back from very far away. "Right," Raoul said. "Just that." They walked through the abbey in the last of the dark. The three of them, their footsteps quiet on stone that had been swept. Jaufré noticed, remarkably clean. The smell of cedar and clove oil was everywhere in the low passage between the scriptorium and the great hall, and he thought he would probably smell it for years in his dreams, in places it had no business being, the way certain things follow you not because they want to, but because they have been pressed too deep to come out. The great hall was already full. Someone had lit every candle. The long table ran the length of the room, and on one side sat the men of Prince Bertrand's household, 4 knights in traveling clothes, their faces tight with sleeplessness and suspicion, and on the other side, 3 men Jaufré had never seen, wearing a livery of dark blue and ash gray that he recognized from the accounts he had once helped Eudes copy. Prince Hugues's representatives. They had ridden through the night. The 2 sides were not speaking. They were watching each other the way that storms watch each other across a valley, still and full and waiting. When Jaufré walked through the door with the Oriflamme in his arms, everyone in the room went very quiet. He was 14 years old, and the silk was cold and heavy, and the candlelight was finding all the gold thread and pulling it bright, and he was quietly and thoroughly terrified. He walked to the center of the room, and he stopped. He told the truth. He told it the way you tell a story to someone you respect too much to decorate, plainly, in order, without softening the parts that needed to be heard sharp. He said where the banner had been. He said who had taken it. He said why. He did not make it smaller than it was, and he did not make Yudes into a monster, because Yudes was not a monster, and Jaufré was not willing to tell a lie, not even a small and comfortable one, to make the story easier to swallow. He said he believed he was saving the kingdom. He said he was wrong about the method. He said he was not entirely wrong about the fear. When he finished, the room was still. Then one of Prince Hugues's men, a heavy, careful man with a gray beard and the look of someone who had been skeptical of everything for 40 years and had been right often enough to keep at it, said, "This is a boy." "Yes," said Raoul, stepping forward from the door. His voice was level and old and entirely certain. "And the boy is right. But there is something else you need to hear, and it comes from me, and I have been keeping it too long." What Raoul said next took some time. He told them about a night 20 years ago. He told them about the old king, King Renaud, who had loved his 2 sons and feared what love between brothers could become when a crown was in the room. He told them about the Oriflamme taken from its reliquary not for battle but for a ceremony conducted by candlelight with 2 infants who would never remember it, a ceremony of shared inheritance, of promise, of the kingdom meant to be held together between 2 pairs of hands rather than fought over by one. He told them that the king had meant to tell his sons when they were grown, and had not, because telling them had meant admitting that he doubted them, and a man who doubted his own sons usually doubted himself more deeply and could not say so. Raoul told it all. His voice did not shake. When he was finished, he reached into his belt pouch and set a small carved horse on the table between the 2 sides, crude, old, the size of a child's fist. Nobody asked what it meant. Somehow nobody needed to. In the doorway, very still, Gaucelm stood listening. His lips were moving faintly, just a little. The way a man's lips move when he is setting words to music in his head. His eyes were bright and entirely unguarded, and he looked, for once, like none of the things he usually performed. Bishop Folca arrived 3 hours later, summoned by the morning rider Raoul had sent before any of them had slept. He came through the abbey gate to find a courtyard where 2 groups of men who had ridden hard to oppose each other were sitting on opposite ends of the same stone bench, arguing loudly and productively about the terms of a joint regency. Someone had brought out cups of wine. The cups were the abbey's good ones, the ones brought out for feast days, and they were being passed back and forth across an imaginary line that had, somewhere in the course of 3 hours, been quietly erased. It was not peace. It was the possibility of peace, which is a different thing, and in some ways a better one, because peace that is still a possibility is a peace that both sides have chosen to keep choosing, and that kind of peace has roots. Yudes was brought before the bishop in the chapter house, not in chains and not in a dungeon, but in an accounting, a reckoning between a man and the consequences of a thing he had done for reasons that were not entirely wrong. The bishop listened with the careful patience of a man who had been listening to hard things for a long time. Yudes answered every question. He did not excuse himself. He looked older, in the morning light, than he had in the basement by the candle, and somehow also more exactly himself, precise and tired, and entirely clear-eyed about the place he had arrived at. When the bishop asked Guillaume, who had been present throughout, what she thought should be done, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "I do not think he should be destroyed." She said it, looking at Jaufré, not at the bishop. Jaufré looked back at her, and the thing he felt was too quiet and too careful to have a name, and he did not try to give it one. The Oriflamme was returned to its reliquary before the noon bell, carried by Jaufré and escorted by Raoul and 3 knights of both households walking together, which was the part that the troubadours would later argue about how to describe, none of them quite capturing it, because some things that matter are too ordinary looking to survive a song. The silk went back into the dark. The reliquary was closed. The abbey breathed. The Oriflamme caught the afternoon sun and held it. The river moved south the way it always had, gold and patient and entirely indifferent to the things that men had nearly done to each other on its banks. The light on the water was the same light that had been there at dawn and would be there at dusk, restless and real, carrying everything and keeping nothing. Guillaume was sitting on the abbey wall watching it. Jaufré climbed up beside her. Neither of them said anything. Below, in the courtyard, Gaucelm was finding his tune, just the shape of it, just the first few notes repeated and reconsidered, the song working itself out from the inside the way songs do when they are real ones. At the gate, Raoul stood with the carved horse in his hand. He was looking north. His face was quiet. The sky was very blue. Jaufré reached inside his tunic and took out the folded piece of parchment. He held it a moment. He read it, just his eyes moving, slow and still, his face doing something careful and private that the story will not follow into. Then he folded it again, more slowly than before, and put it back. Not the same as before, differently. The way you carry something that no longer hurts to hold. Guillaume did not ask. The river moved below them. The tune found its footing. The morning was here.